engine externals, starting with the harmonic balancer.
If your balancer has scratches on the sealing surface, you can fix it with the repair sleeve. Also, if you know your motor won't be started for a few weeks or so, you should coat the sealing surface and the inner diameter with a white lithium grease. Regular grease will be fine though if that's all you have. Fit the balancer onto the nose of the crank and line it up with its keyway. For press-on style balancers, you really shouldn't hammer them onto the crank.
If you have a press-on style harmonic balancer, you're going to want to rent, borrow, or buy a harmonic balancer installing tool and thread it into the same threads as the center bolt on the crank. Draw up the installer nut and start turning. If it seems to bind up as it's going in, check it or pull it off and start again. You don't want to get it crooked and it end up pinching and then might snap off the tool in the nose of the crank. When it gets close or it's all the way in, the crank is going to want to start to spin. You could install your flex plate or your flywheel and disable the rotation of the crank to press it on for the last few millimeters, but you do run the risk of this happening.
That's not good.
That's what we get for buying a cheap tool the first time. The balancer could be in all the way, but later when it's time to line up all the pulleys and belts, then we'll know for sure. Let's move on to the fuel pump and clean its mounting surface. If you have one, lube up your fuel pump push rod and slide it up into the block. If you let go of it, it's going to want to slide right out. Just be aware of that until the pump is ready to go in. If you have a cover plate like this, gasket sealer goes on both sides of the plate gasket, then the plate with its holding bolts. Get some gasket sealer for both sides of the fuel pump gasket and some on its mounting point on the block. For most engines, when the balancer is set to top dead center for the number 1 cylinder, it's easier to install the fuel pump. Make sure that your push rod is up inside the block if you have one, and install the bolts and torque them to spec. Moving on to the front, grab your water pump and its gaskets and put plenty of gasket sealer on all the metal and the gasket surfaces. When it all dries a bit, the gaskets will stick right in place and we can treat the water pump bolts with some type of thread sealer. This will keep the water from inside the block from leaking past the threads. If the bolts that hold your water pump thread into the water jacket area of the block, then you absolutely need to seal these threads. Next, all 4 of these treated bolts got tightened to the pump and torqued to spec. On the top of this motor, the thermostat mounting surface was a little bit pitted from some rust damage, so we just kind of smoothed it out and filled it in with some silicone. Then a little gasket sealer went on both sides of the water neck gasket. Pay attention, make sure that your thermostat is facing the right way before you torque the water neck down. Usually there's a label on them. This heater hose nipple didn't look like it was worth reusing, so a few bucks at the local auto parts store and we shouldn't have to worry about leaks here anymore.
Go through your notes and storage bins, and any of your miscellaneous engine externals should all make it back where they belong. When you get to the exhaust manifolds, you should prep the threads of these bolts with plenty of anti-seize lubricant. This is messy stuff, but it's absolutely necessary to keep these bolts from freezing up with all the heat abuse they get. These manifolds with the air injector tubes need to have the bolts first, then the gaskets before installing them. Sometimes you can thread the bolts in a few turns and then slip the gaskets in between the manifold and head, but only if you don't have exhaust emissions tubes like this.
Exhaust gaskets usually don't need any sealant, and any metallic finishes will face towards the manifolds. We finished sealing up our water system with the water temperature sending unit. Actually, one more thing to check in the water system is whether the pulleys are going to line up. Put the main pulley on the balancer and then hold the water pump pulley and belt in place to make sure that the pulleys are all lining up. If they don't line up, you could either have the wrong type of water pump if it's a new one, or the balancer might not be seated all the way on the crankshaft if that main pulley seems to be sticking out too far. If you want to keep the dust out of the upper valve train, then you can lay your valve covers on now, but don't tighten them yet. Now you want your engine to be off of the stand. We put our dolly wheels on so we could start thinking about rolling this motor out of the shop. You should put your motor mounts on if you're going to be sitting your engine on the floor to reinstall the flex plate and the center bolt.
Once your engine